I believe debugging might be the hardest part of software engineering. When we have a bug, we don't know what's going on, how long is it going to take to fix, how big of an issue it is. And so with Game Plumbing Framework, we've created some tools that will really make debugging as simple as possible. As we stated before, you're going to be doing the vast majority of your work writing server objects. And so when there's an issue with server objects, we want that to be very obvious. So let's run our unit test, and we notice that our test is failing. We expected hello world, but we got goodbye world. And now we have to see what's going on. And it's likely that the bug was in some server code, since we're essentially testing a server object. And usually this is where I would go and start looking at log files to try to piece together what actually happened. And this can be a pretty daunting task, but with Game Plumbing Framework it is pretty straightforward. So let's look at that. First thing, I'm going to go to settings, and I'm going to set my debug level to debug. Now I'm going to run this again. Now we have created a trace file, and I'm going to look at it with the trace diagram tool. So it's going to be in the traces folder, which is at the same level of assets. We have two files here. One of them is from the perspective of simulated cloud. The other is from the perspective of a sinker. In this case, since we only have one sinker, these are going to be pretty much the same thing. And what I'm looking at is the client sent a message to the hello world, to the hello SO. My name is hello SO, got that message and updated his greeting to goodbye world instead of hello world. So the next thing I'm going to do is kind of zoom in to this handler and see what happened. So here's our test. Here's where we send the message. Here's where we receive the message. And I'm just going to put a breakpoint here, because this is where we suspect something's going wrong. I'm going to run this again, and we're going to hit the breakpoint. And look at that. Greeting should be set to hello world, but it's being set to goodbye. I want to be very clear on what just happened. We set a breakpoint on code that's going to be deployed to a real remote server, and we initiated that from the context of Unity. I mean, we could have been playing our game and set this breakpoint, and we're hitting that server code. And again, the reason we're able to do this is because we're using our simulated cloud. But the ability to set breakpoints on server code to debug what's going on, very, very powerful. So I'm just going to turn that into hello, and we'll run our test again. And everything passed. Great. The another really cool thing about Game Plumbing Framework is state is strictly separated from UI. So once you get your state working correctly like we just did, you're going to hand that off, and somebody is going to, maybe a junior developer is going to build some UI around that. And if I was that junior developer, what I would do is I would start by pulling up the Data Store Explorer, because that's going to let them confirm that they are getting all of the values they need. So they can come in here and look, and they can see that the greeting was set to hello world after the test was run, or they could just run the game. They can see that the game was initialized with the greeting, what's your name? And before they've even hooked up any UI, maybe they've just hooked up this button, they can click it and see that the greeting got updated to hello world. And if this said goodbye world, then that junior developer could say, hey, you know, we're not ready to work on the UI, there's still an issue. Or if you see a bug while you're playing the game, you might want to figure out, okay, is this on the server side or is this on the UI side before you get going. you can just use Data Store Explorer to verify that and figure out who to assign that bug to. So, our Data Store Explorer, our ability to set breakpoints and full stack debug in server code, and our trace diagram tool make it super simple for people to debug their issues. Now, admittedly, we looked at a very simple example with Hello World, but why don't we look at what that diagram tool would look like with a more complicated interaction. So here we're looking at, this is rock, paper, scissors. We call this our Rochambeau game. And we have a matchmaker. And we have our client here. And our client is going to, it basically has a player that it's associated with. This player is synchronized. So we really have two versions of this player. One of them is on the client and the other is in the cloud. And for simplicity, we make it look like it's just one entity, but there is kind of a network connection that's bouncing between these. And as we see, and we have this other player. This is the player we're going to play against. And we're sending these messages over, is kind of to reset the state and initialize this thing, give it a profile ID. Profile is another game object, which is completely public, whereas row player is not. And we set the display name. So here, row player goes and sets its display name to the profile, and we can basically see these very complicated interactions of setting a matchmaker, two different players playing, essentially, two different players setting their display name on two sets of server objects that are associated with them, getting into a game, sending their moves up to that game, and then having some kind of resolution on who won that game, and then getting updated. And we can confirm that everything is working as it's supposed to. A lot of times there might be little bugs here, and you're going to be able to catch that with the diagram tool. The other thing you can do is, before you even get started, you can kind of set up your, what you expect the code to do. You can architect your system with these diagrams, and then as you build the system, you can compare and contrast. And sometimes you'll say, oh, we're not building it correctly, and sometimes you'll say, oh, maybe my design wasn't, it didn't foresee these cases. But great way to communicate, great way to debug, great way to think about architecture and server objects. And because server objects are really going to be the heart of what you build, we've done everything we can to make that as easy as possible. Thank you so much.